that would uplift and reflect the realities of Black women who were feminist or Black women who were queer, LGBTQIA plus. What I was doing during those years was to build Black feminism, to build a Black feminist movement, to fight homophobia, particularly in Black context, to build Black women's studies, particularly Black women's literature, because literature was my field. And that's what I, studied on the graduate level and what I loved. So, as I said, it was not a research project. We were making it up from scratch. As Demeter Fraser said, we quoted that in the Combahee River Collective Statement, that this is not a mixed cake. We are making it up from scratch. And believe me, that's exactly what we did. I think it's very difficult for people, contemporary people right now, to understand the level of scapegoating and even actual violence that we endured as we tried to build the movements and the academic intellectual fields that we now almost take for granted.
Thank you. So this is the place where you get to teach us, each of you. Give us a little bit of a window onto your work, your research, your activism, and what it shows us about the history of radical Black, queer, and feminist lives over the 20th and 21st century, the various barriers to freedom and liberation they identified, the freedom dreams they had, and the ways they pressed forward. And we're going to start with you, Laura.
So I think one of the important narratives from thinking about kind of how to imagine this story is, for me as a historian, in terms of the documentation and the history and the narrative of how we understand this context. I first interviewed Dorothy Pittman Hughes with Gloria Steinem, and there was a moment in the interview, it's always the last question that you ask, when I said, was there anything you would do? Did you always agree about everything? And Gloria Steinem said, yes, we were always on the same page. And Dorothy said, well, actually, and proceeded to talk about how she had been afraid to tell Gloria Steinem. They had traveled on the road. In fact, Dorothy talked Gloria Steinem into speaking for the very first time. Dorothy had been an entertainer, was much more comfortable talking in public. And at the time, Steinem was a journalist, afraid to speak in public. And so literally, Dorothy is the person who helps to put Steinem into the public eye on the history of the women's movement. And so at that time, she explained she had been afraid to tell Steinem that she had opted to buy the franchise for the Miss Greater New York City pageant. She had done that because she had 3 daughters, and she had a vision for how to remake ideas in terms of their understanding of themselves. And in fact, she had run the Miss Greater New York City pageant in such a way that all the finalists were either African-American or Puerto Rican descent, and had taken the winner to Atlantic City, where she proceeded to then, I think, sue the Miss America pageant organization for discrimination. This happened in 1989. And shortly thereafter, the lawsuit gets kind of quelched. But in fact, it was a vision around changing kind of images for her daughters of themselves and changing images of the future and what was possible. The lawsuit gets quelched, but very shortly thereafter, Vanessa Williams is the first African-American Miss America. I think that's not to some degree, that's one narrative of her vision of how you remake the vision of what was possible, but she also imagined, that what you taught to children, right? Not only in terms of standing up for and challenging notions of what looked like beauty, or what looked like what they should want to do, but to imagine the childcare center that she opened on the west side, West 80th Street, as a community center and as a place that focused on housing issues, domestic violence prevention, in addition to imagining kind of ways of remaking the way that children and people could see themselves. So for her, it was really about challenging structures all the way through, but imagining the impact and the importance of doing that for the very young, especially.
Thank you.
So trying to fit into the frame of our discussion, I'm going to talk about interventions that I was involved in, and maybe I don't have a good anecdote for you, but I'll maybe try to show like how those interventions made a lot of different lives possible, including those of us who came up with them. The first intervention I would say that was incredibly important was to define something called the simultaneity of oppressions. That is, to look at all the elements of oppression that affected us as Black women, and that also had relevance for everybody else, because very few people are just one thing. And what we wanted to, what we did assert, and what we wanted people to begin to grapple with, is that if we're going to actually get rid of oppression, we have to deal with all of the systems of oppression as they intersect and interlock with each other. Subsequently, the concept of intersectionality, which is now a buzzword, sadly, too often a buzzword, although it's a very sound concept, subsequently that came into existence. But we were talking about this concept in the mid-1970s, and intersectionality, which was a term developed by the brilliant legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, emerged in the late 1980s. So you can see that there was a trajectory and a path. Another thing that we brought out was identity politics, also completely maligned and misunderstood. And people who attack identity politics, but generally they have not read the Combahee River Collective Statement, where we first used the term. What we meant, and here's a notion, as Stacey Abrams announces that she's running again for governor, but what we asserted is that Black women had a right and have a right to define our own political agendas. In other words, that we didn't need to be subjected to the patriarchal Black nationalist agendas that characterized Black liberation movements at the time, nor did we have to be subjected to the ignoring of race and how it connected to gender that characterized the white women's movement. And the thing I think that makes Combahee really significant, and the reason it appears to be very up to the minute, and the reason that people still pay attention to the ideas, is that we were anti-capitalist, that we were part of the left, and we also were organizers. We weren't just thinking about how difficult it was to be a Black woman under a white heteropatriarchy and racial capitalism. We weren't just thinking about it or talking about it or being clever about it on social media, because social media was a letter with a stamp on it in those days. But the thing is that we wanted to do something about the situation. So that's what I have to offer at this point.
Thank you.
I guess I would say there were two very closely related interventions I was trying to make in all our trials. The first would be to show that the sort of question of whether and how to engage the criminal legal system in anti-violence work was really fiercely debated among feminist activists in the 70s and early 80s, which is to say that what we now call carceral feminism, which really, kind of began to be built in that decade, was really fiercely challenged from the beginning. Black feminists and queer women, as Barbara was just describing, were really in the vanguard of this kind of pushback and in developing, an anti-carceral or abolitionist feminist politics, meaning like a feminism that, rejects the idea that sexual and domestic violence can be like policed or incarcerated out of existence in a racist and capitalist and heteropatriarchal society. The grassroots movement to free Joanne Little was really especially important to making this kind of politics possible. Joanne Little was a young Black woman who faced the death penalty in North Carolina in 1974 for defending herself against a white jail guard who sexually assaulted her. And she was incarcerated at the time for burglary and theft in the eastern part of the state when the assault occurred. And she gained a hold of an ice pick that the guard was using to threaten her, and she stabbed him with it. He died of the wounds, and she was prosecuted for murder. And her, the mobilization to free Joanne Little and other cases that involved criminalized Black and Indigenous and Latinx survivors, really changed the game in terms of the conversation about the dangers of a kind of law and order feminism, and also inspired a number of Black community activists like Nikenje Ture, Deirdre Wright, and Loretta Ross to become, leaders in the anti-rape movement of the 70s, and to, forge organizations that refused to accept law enforcement funding and tried to imagine, more transformative responses to violence, interpersonal violence. And then I think like the second and related intervention would be to, try to rethink the geography of both like feminist anti-violence organizing, what we imagine that looked like in the 70s, and also prison organizing in that period. So, when anti-gender violence activism gets reduced to the Rape Crisis Center or battered women's shelter movements of that decade, we miss this whole other landscape of political work that was happening inside and around women's prisons, multi-issue coalitions, and participatory defense movements like the Campaign to Free Joanne Little and many others. And these other kinds of mobilizations were creating a whole other set of political openings for the kind of intersectional feminism that Barbara was describing. I think I'll leave it there for now. I think maybe the last thing I would just add is that participatory defense campaigns in particular were these really messy and, coalitional spaces, really broad spaces. And the book, tries to show how they became portals for some activists, to kind of tumble into prison activism and the ways they moved from a politic of like free Joanne Little to free them all, right? So that kind of shift to an abolitionist consciousness.
Thank you. And just before Moya starts, just as I put in the chat, we want questions. Please feel free to put questions in the chat. We're going to get to them in a few minutes. So just start thinking about your questions. And sorry to cut, Moya, just jump right in.
Sure. Well, one, I think it's so helpful having this going last because I see my work as really showing a bridge and a trajectory of the movements and the organizing that Black women have done before this digital moment that we're in. One of the things I do in Misogynoir Transformed is trace how I started to think about coming up with a name of how that specific anti-Black racist misogyny was being enacted, and noting that it's something that Black women have been talking about for a very long time, just not in those terms. And I definitely see the Combahee River Collective statement as part of that trajectory that I imagine this term fitting into. And I started to think about misogynoir specifically when I was working on my dissertation. I was pre-med and undergrad, and because of my deep commitment to women's studies, I switched tracks and I was looking at some old medical texts in relationship to the dissertation and was surprised to see a lot of the stereotypical images and ways that Black women were being discussed in these medical contexts through images and narratives in yearbooks and in medical textbooks from this moment right after medical schools get really consolidated into the way we understand them now. And this is the 1910s, 1913s, right after the Flexner Report. And I'm doing this research at the same time that I am seeing images and representations of Black women on television that actually haven't changed that much from these images nearly 100 years ago. And it really got me thinking about what is it about this specific representation of Black women that is still animating how people treat Black women, and that it's not just something that stays in one area. It impacts the way Black women are thought about in terms of seeking assistance. You know, the image of the welfare queen being one that actually had material consequences for Black women who were trying to seek and get support for their families. These are things that people can sometimes miss and don't think that media has a real impact on our day-to-day lives. And part of my work was trying to look at the ways that Black women were not just experiencing that, but combating that. And what this digital moment actually affords is the opportunity for people to speak back and to take these digital platforms that have been used to harm them and challenge some of those representations through the content that they create. So digital media becomes the site for perhaps more possibility for organizing and for transforming the way that we experience our world. And the last thing I'll say is that another really important part of what I was thinking about with misogynoir is that some of the people who I see most active in doing this work have been queer and trans Black women who have been at the forefront of using this digital media to challenge some of these representations. And when I think about who is kind of the vanguard and who's leading the call and charge, it's often been queer and trans Black women who are saying that this isn't okay. And that's come in the form of different hashtag initiatives and campaigns, in different web series, and also in the kind of content people are creating on a site like Tumblr and other social media platforms.
Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to jump back in and point our discussion to the contemporary moment. We're regularly seeing new and old forms of race and gender discrimination, misogynoir, transphobia, and homophobia in American society, politics, and the economy today. But can you give us some models from history or from the recent past that can show us a way forward? And Barbara, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Robin. I just wanted to say that in response to Moya, some of those intense conversations that we had early on in the Combahee River Collective were about the images of Black women in media. Media in those days was print media. And there was a magazine called Players, which was the counterpart to Playboy. It was a Black, version or a Black counterpart to Playboy, but it was a lot more violent. It was a lot more derogatory. It was a horrifying experience, and I will never forget, how intense our conversations were, and also our debilitated reactions were when we did consciousness raising. We were doing CR, consciousness raising, and had topics, and that we had that topic more than one time. So there's definitely a continuum. As far as when you talk about history, history is my life. I was born in Jim Crow. I was in elementary school when when Brown versus Board of Education was decided. I was in elementary school, albeit in the North, but the thing is we had segregated schools in Cleveland, Ohio, as they had them in New York City and continue to have all over the country for that matter. So history and life. The example, my favorite example of any organizing that I like to share is SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And the reason I bring it out, there's so many reasons to bring it out, but it was radical organizing, it was democratic, and it was taking leadership from those who were most targeted by the oppression, which was white supremacy. And everyone thinks that their moment is the moment and that everybody that came before their moment was basically an idiot and didn't really have much to contribute. So, you know, everybody's woke now, and people who were like in the backwoods of Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia in the 1960s, having to hide under beds and lie on the floor when night riders came by and shot through, you know, the houses trying to get people killed, and also did a lot of burning and, you know, and then just downright, you know, killings and lynchings. You know, we were all a big joke, but it's not true. There is an incredible history, and then we can go to the Panthers for that matter too. But I just love SNCC because, for one thing, Ella Baker, you know, was the person who set that in motion. Her vision was that strong people did not need strong leaders, and that young people needed to be autonomous from the old guys who were running, you know, the civil rights movement at the time. This is something that Jean knows. Not only does she know a lot about it, she's written about it beautifully. The other thing I wanted to mention was the Combahee River Collective's organizing around the murders of 12 Black women in Boston in 1979 in about a 4-month period. That I thought was the pinnacle of Combahee's practice, politics and practice. I won't go into more detail about that because I know that time is, you know, of the essence. But those are two examples of organizing that I think really make a difference and that we can all learn from today.
The story that I'll share is one of my other book, my co-authored book, #Activism. And it's a story of Jeannie Lauren, who was a Twitter user who didn't really see herself as an activist, but felt compelled to start a Twitter campaign when she heard that one of the jurors from the George Zimmerman trial was going to get a book deal. And so Jeannie took it upon herself to figure out who the editor, publisher was going to be for this particular juror's book deal, and didn't think that it made sense for this juror to profit off of the death of Trayvon Martin in this way and the trial. And Jeannie, through her tweeting and through the people that she helped organize, was able to get that book deal shut down in less than 24 hours. And I think that's just an amazing example of what kind of the digital space can offer us when it's leveraged, and also that somebody who didn't necessarily see themselves as an organizer or an activist was able to make a difference and very quickly. So I really want to think about, what do these digital platforms perhaps give us the opportunity to do that perhaps might be more difficult or challenging if we didn't have them.
So I want to share kind of a vision that I think suggests a model, and this is based on Dorothy's work as well. One of the two books that is held about her, by her, in the Schomburg is a book that she published called, I'm just saying it looks like ethnic cleansing, the gentrification of Harlem. And she wrote that book in direct reaction to what she saw as an undermining of her community and of resources in the community. And so she was able to name what she saw coming in, and is one of the first critical assessments of that and of what was called the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone, which was facilitating the removing of local businesses in Harlem and the consolidation of resources. But I think she did it because she had a vision that she developed through her community controlled child daycare center, and through the notion that, in fact, she fought a kind of city ordinance about city funding and demanded that actually everyone would pay the same rate. At the time, it was $5 a day, which seems unimaginable, right? But it was a vision that, in fact, everyone ought to have a stake in a central model and a place. And she worked with parental volunteers and resources, but really imagined that everyone having a stake in their community was absolutely the most important way to make control. And so I think that that part of her activism is a part that I hope and I see us kind of continuing to have conversations about, but also taking the courage to name things as she did, right? So that's my hopeful story.
I really love this question. And I was thinking about the work that Combahee did around the murders in Boston when it was posed to us. And I think something that links the activist formations I write about in the book with the work that, prison and police abolitionist feminists are doing today is the commitment to, linking different forms of violence and different forms of incarceration, and doing that through coalition politics. So I just would echo Barbara that perhaps there's no better example of that than the work that Combahee did in the vanguard of the Coalition for Women's Safety in Boston in 1979. They were not only generating all these different neighborhood-based, prevention and intervention efforts, but at the same time they were fighting for the freedom of Willie Sanders, who had been falsely accused and prosecuted for the rape of several white women in the city. And making those links, making those connections in real time and through collective action. Just another Massachusetts example, the Coalition to Stop Institutional Violence, which brought together local groups who are part of radical health and rape and domestic violence and anti-psychiatry and prison reform and abolition movements, bringing them all together to fight the creation of these behavior modification programs that targeted imprisoned women who were basically pathologized and punished for challenging their conditions of confinement. And this coalition came up with this term, the prison psychiatric state, really trying to understand those connections between these different systems of confinement and control. And I think we see that through the work of groups like Survived and Punished today, and the California Coalition for Women Prisoners, and the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, and so many others. And I think what all of those groups also do, which is something I tried to lift up in the book, is they engage in inside-outside organizing to make sure, as Barbara said earlier, that those who are most vulnerable, to state violence and most impacted, are subjects, of and leaders of the struggle, and also so that the survival of currently incarcerated people is at the heart, right, of prison abolition work. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I wanted to open it up to the audience, remind you, if you're out there watching us on Zoom, to please put your questions into the chat, into the Q&A function, so that we can bring your voice and your queries into the larger conversation. We've already got some questions, so I wanted to start there from our audience. Okay. First question is about the Supreme Court. How does the Supreme Court's current debate over whether to override Roe relate to the work of queer Black feminist activists over the past several generations? All right, how does the Supreme Court's current debate over whether to override Roe relate to the work of queer Black feminist activists over the past several generations?
Yeah, I'd like to take
On
that one, if I
jump
may.
on in. Yes,
Yeah.
please. Thank you, Barbara.
We were involved in many different kinds of organizing during the 1970s in Boston, in the context of the Combahee River Collective, And one of the things that we worked on, in addition to violence against women, was reproductive freedom, now referred to accurately as reproductive justice. And we, of course, had an understanding then, as we do on December 2nd of 2021, that what the real agenda is to make sure that women are at least second-class citizens, if not third or fourth or fifth. This is about controlling women and also about categorizing women as vessels and putting us back in our place. It helps to reinscribe the status quo if women are subjected to their lives are determined by their reproductive capacity. And that's where we are. And of course, the women who are most gravely affected by the actions in Texas, by this, how this Georgia case will be decided, and then when 25 states or so all get rid of Roe v. Wade and the constitutional right to health care in the form of abortion. The people who are most affected are women of color, people of color who can become pregnant, because not all are women, and are defined themselves or identify as women, and then also women who are poor. Well-off, primarily white women, have always been able to get those services. If you look at the South, the maps they've been showing, the South is solid. What a coincidence that the cradle of the Confederacy also is completely solid about overturning Roe. Wonder what's going on here. But the thing about that map that struck me is that, like, since it is so solid, you have to cross like 12 state lines in order to get to a place where you might be able to have a legal and safe abortion. One of the things that we did in Combahee that I love talking about was to hand out information about reproductive freedom at Dudley Station in Roxbury, which is like, I don't know if there's a counterpart location in Harlem, but Roxbury is the counterpart of Harlem in Boston. And Dudley Station in Roxbury was a huge transportation hub with both an elevated subway and many, many buses. And we actually took it upon ourselves to hand out pamphlets about the right to abortion. And we also made a button that Demita thought of that said, "The right to abortion is a woman's right to life." And we did that, we did that. We dealt with the consequences. At the very same time, we were fighting to end sterilization abuse and also to get quality health care of every kind on every level for the families and individuals in our community. So it's completely relevant. The agenda is to oppress women, period. That's it.
Thank you for that, Barbara. Any other comments from any of the other panelists on the Supreme Court? If not, we'll move into other areas of inquiry. So we're all educators on this panel. And so Drew would like to know if we can suggest an organization, a website, readings, resources that can be shared that would have primary sources that might be curated for students, particularly at the high school level. Can we just rain down some wonderful resources that we like to use as we teach, as we go about our lives as activists and scholars?
I put in the chat the Voices of Feminism collection, that Sophia Smith collection, which is a series of oral histories, including numbers of them conducted by Loretta Ross. I think Barbara Smith's interview is there, but especially a sort of focus on if you're interested in thinking about how to let young people discover these issues and the history of reproductive justice. It's a really marvelous resource.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lauren. Before, I don't mean to cut anyone else, could you just say it again, and where is it located? Is it online, available online?
It's in the chat. It's
Oh, perfect. Mhm.
the Sophia Smith collection, Voices of Feminism.
Perfect. Thank you.
I mentioned in the chat, Trudy.
I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Oh.
Just let me point out, you sent it, Laura, to panelists and hosts. I just sent it to everyone,
Thank you.
and I cited you.
Thank you. It's in the chat now. It's in the chat now. Thank you for that, Barbara.
I was just going to say, I put in the chat the blog Gradient Layer, which is now, Trudy isn't actively updating that blog, but I think it does a really great job of explaining what misogynoir is like, what it feels like for Black women, and uses a lot of contemporary examples to talk about how misogynoir shows up in everyday life. I'd also add a text that I use that I think is really accessible for students is The Color of Violence, which is an insight collection that really does an excellent job of talking about all of these issues in different social contexts around the world.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? I see a few things going into the chat, so please check the chat. Please continue to share. We probably have educators out there in the audience. If there's something that you use to speak to young people about these issues, please feel free to share that resource. And of course, keep the questions coming. Okay.
May I just add, Robin? I
Yes.
put in, when I saw the question before you actually asked it, I put in the Zen Education Project, Black Lives Matter at School. And also there was one other that is slipping my mind, but oh yes, Teaching for Justice, the Southern Poverty Law Centers, K through 12 focused materials.
Thank you. And thank you, Emily Thuma. I see you putting many resources, including transformingharm.org, which I just want to call out. Okay, well, Bonnie wants to know, to what extent are women of varied race and ethnicities able to work together on shared issues today? Should this be a goal even? Or do individual priorities continue to get lost in these multiracial collaborations? Thoughts on this? Women working together across difference.
I think that's extremely important for us to have coalition among women of color. And even that term, people have, I think, sometimes forgotten the history of women of color as a term and what it means for us to come together to think about our experiences as people who are dealing with both the question of sexism and racism at the same time, even though it may be different depending on our location. I think that we haven't done enough of that internal work to understand ourselves as a coalition, and especially in this moment, the idea of being accomplices across racial divide, accomplices as other people of color to other people of color, is work that we desperately need. And I think those conversations need to be prioritized. And it's been difficult, I think, for us to do that.
And I absolutely agree. One of the things that I talk about now or harp on is that there is a history of an anti-racist feminist movement that is unwritten and that people don't know about and act like they don't want to know about it. And one of the things about that anti-racist feminist movement, it was multiracial. So, all the things, there are a lot of books now about white feminism. I'm not sure if I like that concept, because instead of talking about white feminism, I would talk about bourgeois feminism. Because to me, it's reductive, to say that somebody's politics are based solely upon their ethnic, / racial background. Black feminism is a politic, but it is not, as I always say, it's a politic. It's not, we're feminists who are Black. It's like Black feminism is a politic that we developed. It has an analysis, it has a practice. And I just feel like, reducing everything to, the evil white feminist. I mean, not everybody is Sheryl Sandberg, who's a feminist. In fact, very few are. So, yeah, I think all is possible. And as I said, that history of anti-racist feminism is really important to know. You can go back to the late 19th century and even into the early 20th and see that there were white women who were in solidarity, particularly around racial oppression. That again, that gets thrown out. And with the attacks on critical race theory, you can see how and why they wish that to be the case. Those people do not want their precious white children to have any inkling or clue about what kind of country they're actually living in. We've got to protect those white children from having any anxiety at all about whether this is the greatest country in the world, at the very same time that children of color are living in that bad America and in that bad history in the present. So I think all is possible. It's the politics that bring people together, not necessarily the background. I have more in common with some people whose race, ethnicity, background, nationality, religion, you name it, sexual orientation, are totally different from mine than I do with people who have the exact same identities that I do, because we share politics, or either don't or don't.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you. I didn't know if you were trying to say something, Laura, but
And
yes.
I just really quick
I
throw
saw
this
you,
in.
yeah.
Part of the reason I did the book that I did is because Dorothy Pittman Hughes and Gloria Steinem intentionally tried to demonstrate by talking about the difficulty of working in collaboration together in the public sphere for an entire year and a half, when Steinem begins to get made into the figure of white feminism. And I think one of the things I could mark was the way in which the press helped to sort of erase Dorothy and to move Steinem into that central perspective, right? So sort of one of the things we have to do is to test and to question what we think we know. And I just wanted to drop in that the phrase women of color, right, comes out of the 1977 National Women's Conference coalition working together with the Black women's agenda. Black women came in with an agenda, and they managed to sort of remake what was at the time called the minority women's plank into a new and visionary remaking of how we could approach the women's issues and agendas across the board. So that history of that term, I think, is important and something we have forgotten.
Thank you.
Barbara was there.
Thank you. Yes, it's been amazing to hear that history and the scholarship come together. They just are so closely connected. So on that note, we have a question from Letty about capitalism. First of all, her first comment is that it's a pleasure to listen to you all. The second question, the way that she goes, she wants to ask you to talk about your activism regarding anti-capitalism. Can we use the tools of capitalism, or how do we approach this problem? So feel free to tackle this question any way you want, whether it be from a research angle or what you're researching, or your own activist work.
I can say that this question is one that actually keeps me up at night, which is, how do you live your politics in a capitalist world where you both have to participate to survive, but are also deeply wanting to change that entire system and how it impacts people. So one of the ways that I have thought about this is to take it out of an individual realm and to think about the work that you're doing in coalition and in solidarity with organizations that have an anti-capitalist frame, and participating in projects that actually lift that up. So I am part of the Allied Media Projects, which is a Detroit-based organization that supports movements by doing work around media and technology to make the voices of movements stronger and to provide the platforms and infrastructural resources that movements need to keep going. And being a part of that work is one way that I see myself trying to undo and kind of join in with the capitalist decline that we're already seeing in this country. So I think that doing that work in solidarity is one of the ways that I can grapple with the impossibility of trying to undo capitalism through my individual choices in terms of what I buy or don't buy, which helps, of course, but I think doing that work in coalition is really, really, really important.
I really appreciate that so much, Moya, particularly the point about just the importance of organizations. And, I guess I'll kind of come at this question in relation to prison abolition and say that, speaking of buzzwords, we're in a moment, right, where, the word abolition is everywhere. And, to me, and I think to many who have been so instrumental in, kind of building our contemporary prison abolition movement, it is necessarily anti-capitalist. That capitalism and, carcerality, they both thrive on, creating populations and marking them as surplus and as disposable, and on a scarcity mentality and on various forms of exploitation and hierarchy. And it doesn't work to sort of analytically set them side by side like that. But I think, I think that the work today of trying to dismantle policing and imprisonment and build out a different kind of world altogether, it necessarily, that's a left project. That is about, root level systemic transformation. And so I always get kind of allergic when I hear people wanting to kind of say, oh, abolition isn't actually a radical demand. It's just suggesting that we should, let some people out of prison. I'm like, actually, no, that's not abolition at all, right? So to the extent that term, can continue to be, to be a deeply meaningful one. And of course it will always be, because that term has such a rich and important and layered history. But, in this moment, I think it's more important than ever to be explicit about the fact that, right, you can't, the project of building a prison-free world is fundamentally about building a new economy.
And Robin, would you mind repeating the question? I was so busy writing in the chat about having been in Houston for the National Women's Conference, where the term women of color is coined, that I missed the question.
Oh, yes, no worries. So the question was about capitalism, really asking about, asking people to talk about their activism relating to anti-capitalist work, and how can we use the tools of capitalism, or how do we approach the problem of capitalism in our organizing and activism and teaching and writing, however you want to grab onto that question.
Yeah, I don't want to say something that's not relevant to the question, but as a socialist, I see everything being rooted in the fact that we have a violent capitalist economy, political economy, that decides the quality of people's lives in the most destructive and cruel of ways for one purpose, which is profit. And when Emily was talking about how you can't have the kind of carcerality that we have in the United States and elsewhere too, without, that capitalism, really breeds that. It's also, I thought about, like, when I was trying to talk about how controlling women's reproductive choices feeds capitalism as well, because one of the things, women's labor, social reproduction, we reproduce the workforce. We make it possible for workers to come into existence and to function so that those jobs can, those exploitative jobs can be filled. But the unpaid labor of women, all of it is tied. I heard, a few days ago before the Supreme Court arguments that when women do not have access to abortion, they become poorer, they do not complete their educational goals, all kinds of consequences. And I'm saying to the TV, I said, that's the point. That's the point. That's what they want to have. more poor women of color, more poor people. Yeah, sure. Because and see, that's the school. Well, it's not even the school. It's the womb to prison pipeline. Those poor families. Like, what happens to those kids? Sometimes they end up in the prison system that Emily, focuses her work on. So it's just all of a piece. But I know that we're not going to have anything like freedom until we shift to some kind of economic, political, social organizing that puts human needs first.
Thank you.
Can I just chime in a tiny bit?
Yeah, chime in.
My prior work before I came to this last segment was looking at the relationship between eugenics and redlining and asking the question of how we decided to invest in subsidizing home loan mortgages, right, which become the basis for a large part for the discrimination. And part of that is about reproductive pronatalism and deciding that we needed to subsidize a particular version of the middle class to reproduce. And that was a particularly raced and classed vision of who should be reproduced. So in some ways, this project comes out as a reaction to how can we work against those kinds of models. So I think naming it and understanding that violence and understanding that agenda around reproduction as well is important.
Thank you. Thank you. The final question that we'll take from the audience tonight is coming from Nicole. Audre Lorde talked about and centered the erotic in her work as key to Black feminism. I feel like we've forgotten about the erotic in Black pleasure. Do you still see the erotic as a radical feminist medium? If so, any recommendations for how to embed it in our movements? If not, why not? A question about erotic and joy, pleasure.
Yes, I think people have started to take this up again. Not that it hasn't always been there, but there is more conversation now. And one of the ways that you might find a conversation about this is through the work of Adrienne Marie Brown and her book called Pleasure Activism, in which she talks specifically and builds on Audre Lorde's uses of the erotic to talk about what pleasure means and what it means for our future and our imagined liberatory world that we hope to create. Because again, of course, we don't want to do all of this work, destroying capitalism, upsetting all of these things to live in a world that actually is no fun, isn't what we want it to be. And her book is helpful also in trying to get people to think about who gets to be in these revolutionary imagined futures, so that it isn't just the playground as we've seen in some future scientific utopias, that it's only the playground for the able-bodied or for people who are thin or etc. There are real opportunities for us to imagine all of us coming into the future. And I think speculative fiction is another place where I see a lot of organizers trying to think about and imagine, what does pleasure look like in a world where we are really free? How are we thinking about what our sexual practices are if we don't have the same hierarchies and infrastructure informing and subtly really shaping the way we think about love, sex, and all other aspects of the erotic?
Thank you. Does anyone else want to take that up? That was
Any other
really-
final remarks as we close out, either linking some of these last questions?
Mhm. Okay, well, it's been such a joy. I'm going to turn it over to Jean, who will make some final remarks.
First, we just wanted, Robin and I wanted to thank both this panel and then the audience. We're sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning, but thank you so much for this conversation, for this community tonight. It feels particularly kind of moving to be together tonight. After the break for the holidays, we are back always on the first Thursday of the month. So our next first Thursday program will be Thursday, February 3rd, 2022. It's going to be on the history of Black New York in the 20th century, featuring Christopher Hayes, Paula Marie Seniors, Tammy Brown, and Ariella Rotramo. Again, if you don't have our panelist books, they are available online at the Schomburg shop. Please get them. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. And oh yeah, and please follow us at Schomburg CBFS on Twitter. Thank you so much and have a good and safe evening.
Thank you, everyone.